Good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure to see you at the Menil Drawing Institute. My name is Edward Kopp. I'm chief curator here. And tonight, we're going to have the pleasure of listening to Professor Anna Lovatt, who's going to talk to us and give us a talk titled Lines of Resolution, Drawing in the Small Screen. And Anna is the inaugural Menil Drawing Institute's research fellow. And the fellowship program at the Drawing Institute is really a key part of what we do. And our goal really is to foster the highest level of scholarship in the realm of drawing, with a particular interest in the medium's history, practice, theory, and criticism. And we offer actually three kinds of fellowships. So one is the predoctoral fellowship, which is for doctoral candidates who work in art history and focus on drawing. Another fellowship is the Morgan Menil Fellowship, which we share with the Morgan Library and Museum in New York, and which involves residencies at both institutions. And then finally, the Research Fellowship, which Anna is the first recipient of, which has a kind of broader spectrum because it's not only for scholars, it's also for conservators, artists, writers, critics, choreographers, anyone who has a serious project or interest in drawing. So now I'd like to say a few introductory words about Anna. She earned a master's degree and a PhD from the Conceptual Institute of Art in London. And she's currently on leave from a role as Associate Professor of Art History at Southern Methodist University in Dallas. And her research really focuses on art of the 1960s onwards, with a particular interest in drawing and diagramming in conceptual art, land art, minimalism, and video art. And our current project is on visualizations of kinship in contemporary art, and it explores the role of new technologies in representing and reconfiguring family relationships since the 1970s, beginning with video works by artists such as Chicago Kubota, Dennis Oppenheim, and Ulrike Rosenbach. A recent book, which you see here, so happy to produce it, is titled Drawing Degree Zero, The Line from Minimal to Conceptual Art. It's a very, very thoughtful and very well argued and written book. And our main contention is that post-minimal and conceptual artists challenge long-standing presumptions about the practice of drawing, rendering it systematic rather than autographic, public rather than private, and conceptually rigorous rather than manually dexterous. Anna has organized a few exhibitions, including Bob Lowe, Ideas, Energies, Transmutations, which was at the Richard Saltoun Gallery in London in 2020. And before that, she had curated a show titled Michelle Stuart, Drawn from Nature, which was first held at the Janogly Art Gallery at the University of Nottingham in the UK, and which then traveled to the Parrish Art Museum in New York State and to the Santa Barbara Museum of Art. And the show was very well received. I should also add that Anna is one of the most talented scholars working on the field, in the field of modern contemporary drawing today, so we're very fortunate to have her. So our lecture this evening is really focused on a research project here at the Drawing Institute, which explores the relationships between drawing, television, and video art of the 1950s to the 1980s. And before turning it over to her, I'd like to remind everyone to turn off your cell phones if you haven't done so already. And as all Menil public programs, this program is recorded and it will be made available within a few weeks on the Menil YouTube channel. At the end, there'll be time for Q&A, so please keep your questions for the end. And now please join me in welcoming Anna.
Thank you, Edward, and thanks everyone for joining us, especially in this beautiful weather outside. I appreciate you coming indoors to hear me talk about drawing in the small screen. And I want to begin by saying what an honor it is to be the inaugural research fellow here at the Menil Drawing Institute, to work in this beautiful building and to have access to this fantastic collection of modern and contemporary drawing. So I'm going to be talking about the research project I'm working on here, which is called Lines of Resolution, Drawing and the Small Screen. And this project really looks at the relationships between drawing, television, and video in art of the 1960s to the 1980s. I should say I've only been here at the Menil for 6 weeks, so this is in the early stages, and to use a drawing metaphor, I'm going to be really sketching the contours of this project today. It is a work in progress, and I'd be really interested to hear any feedback or questions you have after my talk. So writing about Robert Rauschenberg's transfer drawings, 4 of which are in the MDI collection, Rauschenberg's close friend John Cage said, "The pencil lines scan the images transferred from photographs. It seems like many television sets working simultaneously, all tuned differently. How to respond to this message? These transfer drawings are made by soaking newspaper and magazine images in turpentine or lighter fluid, and then pressing those images to a sheet of paper and rubbing them from behind, transferring them from one surface to the other. And they would then be augmented with other materials. So in Spinner and Game, which you can see here, we see images of baseball players and baseballs, but also these gestures in watercolor, graphite, and gouache, which really augment those solvent transfers. Rather than drawing these images with his own hand, Rauschenberg moved his pencil back and forth in a scanning motion, transferring ready-made printed images from one surface to the other. And we could say that these images really seem to crackle with static interference, sometimes coming into focus and other times drowned out by noise. As Cage writes, we're also bombarded with multiple images simultaneously, which really creates a distracted viewing experience, much like flicking between channels on a television, or perhaps gazing at a bank of monitors, all tuned differently. But Rauschenberg went even further, suggesting that his approach to drawing indicated a new and thoroughly contemporary sensibility that was shaped by televisual experience. When he was asked why the images in the transfer drawings and also in his combines were printed rather than drawn, Rauschenberg said, "I don't want my personality to come through in the piece. That's why I keep the television on all the time and the windows open. I want my paintings to be reflections of life, and life can't be stopped." So this kind of sensory overload with the TV blaring and the windows open resulted in a new kind of drawing that was based on a total receptivity to external messages rather than the expression of the artist's inner self through autographic gestures that seem to emanate from within. So my project, Lines of Resolution, Drawing and the Small Screen, explores the multifarious ways in which artists responded, like Rauschenberg, to televisual imagery, also to the new object of the television set in the studio, and to both interactive and more passive modes of viewing. I'm particularly interested in those instances, like Rauschenberg's transfer drawings, where drawing is transformed through contact with these new media, and new in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, of television and video, and also the graphic possibilities of television and video art. So for Rauschenberg and many other artists in the 1950s and 60s, the television was a constant but relatively new presence in the studio. Although inventors had been experimenting with televised images since the 1920s, television sets only really became commonplace in homes, but also in spaces like studios from the 1950s onwards. And of course, in the US, this coincided in art with a move away from abstract expressionist painting to neo-Dada and pop art, which were movements far more open to mass cultural imagery, but also to the convergence of different media. So painting, sculpture, drawing, but also television, film, and video. So rather than viewing the television as an unwelcome distraction, for Rauschenberg it was actively embraced and incorporated into aspects of his work. And we can see here Rauschenberg and the artist Sturtevant working at the table in the background, and Christopher Rauschenberg sitting on the chair while the choreographer Steve Paxton watched his TV on the floor. As Brandon Joseph has written, the transfer drawing election, and this is in a private collection, was made as Rauschenberg watched the broadcast of the presidential contest results between John F. Kennedy and Richard Nixon on TV in November 1960. And earlier that year, the presidential debate between Nixon and JFK was famously the first such debate to be televised. And it placed new emphasis on how these candidates came across on television, so how they looked and spoke on TV. So Rauschenberg, watching the results of the election, which JFK won, incorporated magazine images of JFK and Jacqueline Kennedy, along with a faint image of Pat and Richard Nixon disappearing in the upper right-hand corner. And Rauschenberg even associated the palette of this drawing with the mass media. So he described this purple under Jacqueline Kennedy as a headlined, televised, radioed purple, and he adds it here in watercolour underneath her transferred image. So this is made as the election results unfolded, and it shows how artists were responding to televised images in real time and incorporating them into their drawings. We could compare it, I think, to Philip Guston's series Poor Richard, made in the summer of 1971. And this is a moment of public dissatisfaction with Nixon's presidency following the conviction of Lieutenant William Calley for his role in the My Lai massacre in Vietnam, and also the leak of the Pentagon Papers that revealed the true extent of US military involvement in Vietnam. And the Vietnam War was often called the first television war or the living room war because it was bringing these images of conflict into people's homes. So Guston, in these drawings, traces the life of Richard Nixon, and several of them involve Nixon admonishing the viewer from a television screen placed in a domestic setting, like this image, which shows it on a table with a tablecloth. So as he admonishes the viewer, his nose becomes progressively longer and more phallic. And we could say that while Rauschenberg is really celebrating JFK's win in 1960, and he actually offered this drawing election to the president as a gift, Guston's drawing offers a biting caricature of another president who was really attempting to turn the mass media to his own advantage. And artists in the USA weren't the only ones to respond to the televised image. In Germany, Karl Otto Gertz's experiments began when he was drafted into the German Air Force during World War II. So as a soldier, he was forbidden to paint or to exhibit, but he began experimenting with the cathode ray tube that was used in radar, and this could be manipulated to create abstract images on the radar screen. The cathode ray tube is a vacuum tube containing electron guns, and the beams from these guns can be manipulated to display images. The technology was used in radar displays, in computer monitors, and in television screens. And the electron beams scan the screen in a rectangular pattern of parallel lines, which are called raster lines. In the raster pictures he began in 1959, Gertz divided sheets of cardboard into a grid, and then selected a ratio that defined the relationships amongst what he called different levels of brightness. So here the ratio is 12 to 1, and the different levels of brightness are these yellow, orange, and grey marks in felt tip pen, and they're arranged according to a predetermined system. So he considered the pictures generated by this system to be electronically programmed, and the very structure of the image was seen by Gertz to mimic the raster lines on the television screen. We can also see the influence of these works on Gertz's famous student, Sigmar Polka, who completed his own series of raster drawings and paintings from the early 1960s onwards. And this is a portrait of Lee Harvey Oswald made in 1963 after the assassination of JFK. And we can see he's using the dots similar to those in commercial printmaking, which Ellen Lupton talked about in her brilliant lecture at the Menil a few weeks ago. Here, Polka creates the dots by dipping the eraser of a pencil in ink and pressing it repeatedly to the surface. So he's using this tool usually used to eradicate the mark to generate these repeated circular marks. But despite this emphasis on a printing process, the term raster links these drawings to television, as does the subject Lee Harvey Oswald. So in 1963, the TV coverage that followed the assassination of JFK was really transformative in the history of American television. Commercial breaks were stopped and live coverage continued on the day of the assassination and then 3 days after. And this was the first use of continuous live coverage. In 1962, the Korean-American artist Nam June Paik responded to Lamont Young's instruction, draw a straight line and follow it, by dipping his hands, his necktie, and his head in black ink and using them to draw a line on a long roll of paper. And this performance took place at the Fluxus Festival at the Museum Wiesbaden in Germany, and this was actually broadcast on German TV as well in 1962. The following year in Wuppertal, Paik exhibited 12 modified televisions, which had their images inverted or distorted, or abstract images on their screens, such as stripes, dots, and a single white line, which you can see here, running across the screen. And Paik later said that this work on the right, Zen for TV, occurred accidentally when a television was damaged in transit. But he credited his interest in television to Karl Otto Gertz, who he'd befriended in Germany during the early 1960s. So I think we could consider Zen for TV another instantiation of Lamont Young's composition 1960 number 10, a kind of electronic drawing that appears to isolate the electron beam's scan line as a kind of image in its own right. When the original television set was lost, Paik recreated this effect many times by manipulating the image with an electromagnet. And in addition to incorporating televisual images into their work, artists also reflected on the presence of this strange new object, the television set, in the studio. So I'm showing you here a work by the conceptual artist Erin Piper, and this is part of her hypothesis series where she maps the relationships between objects in time and space. And she does this on these drawings on graph paper, incorporating photographs of the objects, but also in typewritten text pieces. And several works in the hypothesis series focus on the new television set that Sol LeWitt had bought Piper in 1969. So here she writes, "Time is variable, space is constant. I sit in front of my new TV, Sol's birthday present, debating whether to turn it on immediately or to get back to work." So she's contemplating the potential for distraction through the intrusion of this new object in her studio. In some of the hypothesis works, like this one, the television set is turned off and we see her flash repeated in the glare of its screen. But in others, it's turned on, and we see Piper photographing advertisements, for instance, for headache pills. So given her interest in temporal and spatial relationships, it's striking how turning on the television set introduces these new locations and new durations into the space of the studio. On this drawing from 1963, Walter de Maria writes in the bottom right-hand corner, "There's a TV in my future." And at this point in the early 1960s, de Maria is mainly working in drawing. So the land artworks he later became known for only began to be executed later in the 1960s. At this point, he's planning them in the medium of drawing. So here he draws a television set, and it seems to emit a kind of pool of light coming from underneath it, as well as radiating lines from the top of it, like a kind of electronic sun. And interestingly, the television historian Susan Murray has written about the 1950s and 60s as a moment of mounting anxiety that television sets were emitting X radiation, which was a concern that eventually prompted the Surgeon General to urge viewers to maintain a distance of 6 feet when looking at the screen, and then prompting millions of parents to tell their children not to sit so close to the TV. So this cultural anxiety regarding radiation was really bound up with the role that nuclear weapons were playing in the Cold War. And as Murray writes, colour television in this instance was not just bringing images of the contemporary world into the home, but it was also, as an object, physically manifesting one of the world's most pressing and feared perils. And some credence was given to this anxiety in 1967 when it was found that actually colour TVs were emitting X radiation in excess of desirable levels. So the FDA put in place new policies to regulate radiation emission from all electronic products, and manufacturers began to use glass plates to suppress the radiation from television cathode ray tubes. For an artist like de Maria, with his interest in boxes and containment on the one hand and invisible energies on the other, the television set was an intriguing and ambivalent object within the space of the studio. And this idea of a box or field emitting colourful rays recurs in several of de Maria's drawings in the MDI collection. In this one, we see 2 boxes rendered in coloured pencil. One of them on the left is rectangular, more like a television set, whereas the other is a more abstract rectilinear form. The rectangular box has a screen-like frame, but the lines emanate from the left-hand side nearest to the viewer, and it's probably hard for you to see, but these lines are labelled rays, so the box is emitting these red rays. The word thought is written to the right of the box, and the word touch is crossed out underneath, really emphasizing conceptual experience over the tactile. Drawings like this develop de Maria's interest in the radiating television set in more abstract directions, exploring the tension between the box as a container and its visible or invisible emissions. And following this line of inquiry, we could look at Small Landscape, a stainless steel box containing 8 framed drawings, each consisting of a single word on a sheet of paper. And they're impossible to see here. They're very faintly written, but the words are tree, mountain, cloud, sun, river, sky, field, and glass. So together they form this small landscape. This box has a velvety black interior grooved with channels, so the viewer can move between these images, combining and interchanging them. But once they're slid into the box, as you can see on the left-hand side, we can't actually see them. So it's different to a television image in that they're concealed within it. And the overall impression is one of invisibility and internment rather than visuality, transmission, or spectacle. So perhaps suggesting a certain resistance to those in de Maria's practice. Between 1974 and 1975, de Maria collaborated with the artist and inventor Tom Shannon and the inventor Maris Ambatz on a large screen video projector system. And they actually exhibited this system at the Consumer Electronics Show in Chicago in 1974. So this was a computer-designed plastic lens that would fit over a regular TV screen and project the image onto a screen 6 to 12 feet away, enlarged. So it was essentially a way of turning the image on your TV into an almost cinematic image, like watching a movie. And they envisaged it being used mainly for sporting events. So it's designed to enable people to show what's on their television on a larger screen. So Ambatz, de Maria, and Shannon hoped to license this invention to one or more of the television manufacturers they were in serious discussions with in 1974. And this working drawing, which is in the MDI collection, lists a number of manufacturers. So at the top, we see Magnafox, Philips, Zenith, and lower down, we see Toshiba, Panasonic, Sony. And they were actively approaching these different manufacturers about their new invention. De Maria also lists the components of a television set towards the bottom right. Single tube, screen foil, focus, brightness, frame, and a clear tube face. And towards the top, he mentions radiation and X-ray emissions, and also risk, which was no doubt a concern given the magnification involved in this project. So de Maria called this the TV project, and there are several drawings related to it, but he did regard it as separate from his artistic practice. It was more of an entrepreneurial scheme designed to make money to fund his artistic practice. But I still think we can think of his working drawings like this as artworks in their own right, which show his thought processes as he's engaging with the TV project. And besides its physical presence in the studio and its money-making possibilities, television offered a means of communicating with broad and distant audiences. So beginning in the 1960s, de Maria made a number of drawings related to works in the desert, and this is one of them in the Menil Drawing Institute, which refers to a rope that would be stretched for half a mile in the desert, and visitors could follow it out if they wished. So this rope would guide the walker's path, but it would be a path to nowhere. The only objective of this guiding line would be for the walker to follow it out into the desert and then follow it back. And although he was thinking about ideas like this in the early 1960s, it was only in the late 60s that de Maria realized these works with his mile-long drawing, which is 2 parallel lines of white chalk extending for a mile in the Mojave Desert. And this is executed in 1968, but de Maria revisited the work as part of the TV gallery exhibition Land Art, organized by the video and broadcast pioneer Gerry Schum in 1969. And this was a gallery aired on German television, which featured work by different land artists. So de Maria's contribution to land art was called 2 Lines, 3 Circles on the Desert, and it was filmed at the site of the mile-long drawing that he'd produced the previous year. And when you look at these images, you might think, well, I can see the 2 lines, but where are these 3 circles? So for the TV gallery, he made a 4-minute film in which the camera rotates 360 degrees 3 times. So these are still images, but if you were to watch the video, you'd be aware of the camera rotating as de Maria walks further and further down the lines and swings in and out of view. So the 3 circles are inscribed not in chalk, but by these circular pans of the camera. And as James Nisbet has demonstrated, this work really shows how drawing need not be confined to a particular set of materials or techniques. Nisbet writes, drawing lines can generate creative processes that lead to creative expressions in painting, sculpture, or in this case, in film and television. And interestingly, of the 8 artists in Schum's land art exhibition, 5 of them, De Maria, Jan Dibbets, Richard Long, Dennis Oppenheim, and Michael Heiser, involved lines drawn on the surface of the earth. And we could speculate about why this would be. They knew that this work was going to be shown largely on black and white television. It was being filmed in black and white. So these graphic gestures would really make an impact for the audience watching at home. And drawing remained prominent in Identifications, which was the second exhibition organized by Schum as part of his TV gallery. In the video Lumaca, the Italian artist Mario Merz placed a live snail on a sheet of glass parallel with the camera's lens. And he proceeded to draw the spiral of the snail's shell before drawing a straight line out from the center and demonstrating how the proportions of the spiral corresponded to the Fibonacci series, which was a long-term interest of Merz's. So the narrator reads the Fibonacci series in German. Again, this is being broadcast on German TV, highlighting the mathematical logic of the spiral for a television audience. And hopefully I'll be able to play a short clip of this for you now.
Zahlenreihe des Fibonacci. 1, 1, 2, 3, 5, 8, 13, 21, 34, 55, 89.
So like the turns performed by De Maria's camera, this drawing is performative, and it unfolds as a moving image rather than taking the form of a static object. And although we might associate television with consumerism and advertising, Schum saw it as a way of democratizing the viewing of art by making works that could not be owned by anyone, but that could be seen by many. So he said that the TV gallery only exists in a series of TV transmissions, meaning it's more or less a mental institution that comes into existence in the moment of transmission by TV. He said it's no place to show real art objects, which you can buy and carry home. One of our ideas is the communication of art instead of the possession of art objects. As viewers of this video, we look through the support, witnessing Merz in the act of drawing. And for the audience watching at home on German TV, it must have seemed as though the artist was inscribing the screen of their television from behind. And in fact, early viewers were encouraged to treat the television screen as an interactive drawing surface, which might be surprising when we think that television is so often associated with passive consumption. So I'm showing you here children interacting with a TV program screened by CBS in the 1950s called Winky Dink and You, which used what the producers called a magic drawing screen. And this was a sheet of vinyl plastic that could be adhered to the screen with static electricity. And viewers could purchase this sheet along with a set of crayons for 50 cents. So the cartoon character Winky Dink would ask children to complete a connect the dots picture, to fill in the gaps in a secret message, or to draw a character that the presenter would then engage in a conversation. And this was extremely popular in the 1950s, but it was eventually cancelled due to concerns about the X-ray emissions generated by cathode ray tubes, but also because parents complained that if their children didn't have this magic drawing screen, they were drawing on the television set in permanent marker. The series was revived in the 1970s and then again in the 1990s. So early viewers were already being encouraged to interact with their television screens, prefiguring much later conceptions of the screen as a tactile interface. And this idea of the television screen as a surface for drawing was explored in the series of video drawings Howardena Pindell began in 1973. So at this point, Pindell was known for her paintings, which were made by perforating templates with a hole punch and then spraying through those templates to create large canvases. And she also kept the hole punch circles and numbered them and made very intricate conceptual drawings using those numbered circles. In this process, however, she strained her eyes, and her optometrist recommended that she focus on something in the distance as a break from this very close work. So she purchased a TV for her studio, and she started watching it as a break, becoming really fascinated by the dynamic images of sporting events that she saw. And she'd already begun making drawings like this on transparent acetate, and she realized that the static of the TV screen allowed them to adhere these drawings to its surface. So she set up a camera on a tripod and waited until she saw a compelling interaction between the image on the screen and these points, arrows, and numbers that make up her drawings on acetate. So at this moment, Pindell took a photograph, and she calls the resultant image a video drawing. So it's a photograph, but incorporates this drawing on acetate. And these abstract drawings both complement and interrogate the images underneath. So on the one hand, the arrows seem to suggest lines of force as these athletes are moving dynamically across the screen. But on the other hand, these numbers suggest that these bodies are being scrutinized and evaluated, not only in the context of competitive sports, but also by the viewers watching at home. And in the 1970s, as now, televised sporting events were charged arenas where societal expectations could be challenged and where protests for racial and gender equality could be staged. At around the same time, in the former Yugoslavia, Ivan Ladislav Galeta performed his Telegrafica at an exhibition in Zagreb in 1978. And this was a live performance with a row of television sets, and he would inscribe them in response to the images on screen with these lines that you can see on the left-hand side. And then the lines would remain as the images changed, setting up new relationships between the drawing and the televised images. Sometimes these new images would actually fall in line with the drawings, really highlighting the predictable forms of television imagery. In his works noting the camera movement and TV zoom, which you can see on the right here, Galeta highlighted the movement of the camera over the image it captured. And he actually had a background in filmmaking, so he's really trying to draw attention to these almost invisible cinematic devices. In the image with the arrows on the left-hand side, you can actually see Galeta's hand caught in the act of drawing as he's photographed while making these performative works. So this responsive and performative approach to drawing, where the graphic gesture reacts to an external image or impulse, was also explored in the transfer drawings the American artist Dennis Oppenheim made with his children in the early 1970s. And I'm showing you here a photographic image because this video is very grainy, but it gives you a sense of the performance, which was Oppenheim inscribing a line on his son's back, which his son then tried to replicate on Oppenheim's back. And this was performed for the video camera, so there was no live audience. It's designed to be recorded in the new medium of video. And this new medium was actually characterized by the phenomenon of feedback, which is something Oppenheim talks about in this drawing. It's titled A Feedback Situation, and he talks about his movement being fed through his son Eric's sensory system. So video was characterized by this mechanism of feedback, which is created when a camera is pointed at its own playback monitor. So this kind of feedback loop, which you can see diagrammed here, and then the effect is these receding images that are identical but smaller and shown at a slight delay, which you can see on the right-hand side. So this effect was used in a lot of 1970s music videos to create that kind of trailing or infinite tunnel effect. But for artists, the medium of feedback offered a powerful metaphor for thinking about human beings, technologies, and environments as interacting components of a complex system, so what came to be called a media ecology. And feedback also refers to the way in which elements of the system respond to and self-adjust to one another, as we see Oppenheim and his son doing in this video. So I'd suggest that Oppenheim isn't just recording a performative drawing in this video. Instead, he's making graphic gestures that actively mimic the structural and temporal qualities of this new medium, particularly this idea of the feedback loop. And a related yet different kind of responsivity occurs in the American artist Joan Jonas's 1972 video, Right Side, Left Side. Like Oppenheim's A Feedback Situation, this is performed just for the camera rather than for a live audience. So to create this video, Jonas set up a monitor and a mirror side by side, and a camera placed behind them filmed her as she performed various gestures in the mirror. And these gestures were then relayed to the monitor. So she's looking at herself doubled. On the right is the mirror, and on the left is the monitor. Confusingly, the camera doesn't reverse the image in the way that the mirror does. And Jonas really plays with this ambiguity between what is her left side and what is her right side. A second camera was positioned behind Jonas, and it captured both the mirror and the screen. And her final video cuts between footage from that camera and the camera that was pointed directly at her. So this intersection of drawing and performance and new media has been a common thread throughout Jonas's career. In a later work called Brooklyn Bridge from 1988, she used early computer graphic tools to make line drawings that interact with photographs and videos of the bridge at the moment of its anniversary celebrations. So this work really updates a tradition of drawing on celluloid that can be traced to experimental filmmakers like Stan Brakhage and Len Lai. And in the final part of my lecture tonight, I want to consider artists who use drawing to critique and deconstruct the power television exerts over its audience. In her multimedia installation, 4 Messages, the Peruvian artist Teresa Berger took 4 sentences at random from Peruvian television channels on December the 27th, 1973. And she then transformed these sentences into what she described as new sign structures. So there is a set of slides projecting images of a calculator, a film of a face, which you can see here, pulling different expressions, and these geometric drawings made by letters typed on a typewriter, which you can see on the right-hand side, as well as an audio recording of distorted sounds. So at this moment, the military dictatorship in Peru had expropriated the country's major newspapers and television channels. So only platforms that shared the aims of the regime were allowed. And although as an artist working in Peru, attacking the regime directly would have been perilous, Berger's installation can be seen to engage in a deconstruction and reconfiguration of televised messages. In 1976, in her elementary map series of videos, the Brazilian artist Ana Bela Geiger used cartography to raise questions about the political situation in Brazil, which was also then under authoritarian rule. In elementary map number 1, she draws a map of the globe on paper, while the song My Dear Friend, released that same year by the Brazilian musician Chico Buarque, plays in the background. And Buarque's song takes the form of a letter updating the reader on life in Brazil under the military dictatorship. It begins with niceties referring to the weather and national pastimes such as soccer and samba. But then the chorus breaks through this facade, saying, "What I really want to tell you is that things here are black." So this is playing in the background as Geiger draws, and the song then begins to refer to corruption, high taxation, and a climate of fear. Against this soundtrack, Geiger continues her drawing of the map of the world, ultimately blacking out the country of Brazil. So the medium of video allows her to engage with this soundtrack in real time, but the drawing also mimics the sudden revelations in Buarque's song. So this seemingly innocent action of drawing a map suddenly erupts into unexpected political commentary. And for feminist artists like Sandra Ivekovic, drawing could also be used as a tool of political critique. In instructions number 1, Ivekovic looked directly into a video camera, applying arrows to her face and neck in black ink. And these arrows seemed to pull and mold her face, but rather than instructing the viewer on how to alter their appearance through makeup or plastic surgery, Ivekovic was interested in the forces, the pressures exerted on women's bodies and faces by images in the media. And towards the end of this video, you can see in the bottom right, she rubs out the arrows with her fingertips, leaving dark smudges of ink on her skin. This is one of a series of works where Ivekovic was engaged with what she called the sweet violence enacted by images of women in the media. And she's working in the former Yugoslavia under what was called the Third Way, which was a political experiment that combined elements of socialism with free market capitalism. So in this video, Sweet Violence, she took broadcasts from Zagreb's economic propaganda program, but recorded them on a television set that had been modified with these lines of tape. And she talks about these as bars, highlighting the prisoners' captivity to these media images. In the US, feminist artists like Dara Birnbaum also used drawing to critique the images of femininity circulating in the media. So in 1987, Birnbaum was invited to contribute to MTV Art Breaks, which was a series of short videos in which Jean-Michel Basquiat, Richard Prince, and Andy Warhol also participated. And Birnbaum said that her friends discouraged her from participating in this mass media spectacle, but she saw it as an opportunity to analyze gender stereotypes at one of the sites of their production. So this video begins with an appropriated film from the Cartoon Factory, which is a 1924 animation you can see on the left-hand side. And that film begins with the cartoonist Max Fleischer sitting at a drawing table and drawing the outline of a city and his famous character Coco the Clown, as you can see in the top left. Fleischer then plugs a cord into his drawing surface and pulls a lever, and his drawing instruments take on a life of their own. This is really amazing animation, which you can see on YouTube. So the drawing instruments begin to move around the page, drawing without the animator's help. And they draw a machine for drawing, which you can see on the bottom left, which has an eraser and an inkwell. And Coco the clown oils this machine and is able to get it to generate any image he desires. So first of all, a roast chicken appears, and then this woman dressed in flapper girl attire appears and blows him a kiss. But the moment he leans in to kiss her, she's erased by the eraser, and he continues his exploits with the drawing machine for the rest of the video. So Birnbaum uses that part of the 1924 animation, but she also changes it, and I'm going to show you her animation here. So in order to modify the narrative here, she found an animator who'd worked for Fleischer's Studios in the 1940s and who did cell animation where images are hand-drawn on transparent sheets. And Birnbaum commissioned the animator to make new images that she then edits into the 1924 film. So the kiss blown by the woman turns into an MTV logo, which knocks Coco out of the frame, and this drawing machine then goes haywire, drawing a series of feminine types in fashions dating from the 1920s to the 1980s. And at the end of this short, we see a contemporary woman animator at work, combining images in post-production on a computer screen, and one of those images is actually of the cartoonist Fleischer, so extending this interplay of authorship and representation that runs through the entire film. And in conclusion, I wanted to show you a work planned for the Southwest Freeway here in Houston by the collective Ant Farm. So Ant Farm was founded in 1968 in San Francisco by Chip Lord and Doug Michaels. But in 1974, they were both visiting professors here at the University of Houston. They proposed to drive a modified Ford Thunderbird up a ramp, jump over the Southwest Freeway, which is now part of the US 59 and the I-69, and the car would then crash into a pyramid of burning television sets. And this entire event would be filmed by multiple media at once, as you can see in the bottom center of this image. So it was never executed in Houston, but the following year, they did execute a more famous version of it called Media Burn in San Francisco. And here they crashed a customized Cadillac convertible through a pyramid of television sets, having notified local television news broadcasters to be present for this event. So they described the USA at this moment as a nation addicted to television and the constant flow of media, asking, haven't you ever wanted to put your foot through your television screen? And Media Burn did this on an epic scale, using TV to destroy TV, in the words of Doug Michaels. So from the affirmative stance of Rauschenberg's transfer drawings with their embrace of televisual imagery to this violent attack wrought by Ant Farm, I hope in this lecture today to have shown some of the many ways in which artists brought drawing into dialogue with television and video when these mediums were in their infancy, transforming the medium of drawing in the process. Thank you.
And I have a mic here if anybody has a question. You want to raise your hand?
Thank you. Thank you so much, Anna. That was really a pleasure. I have a lot of questions. Maybe I can, I'd love to hear how you came to this project. That's one of my questions. And then another one had to do with how much you've thought about, and it seems like you've touched on this in a number of the artists that you introduced, starting with Howardena Pindell, the ways in which a lot of these artists are using the screen of the television specifically, not, like the silver screen that also, people had access to, but the intimate scale, the almost paper-like scale of the television screen to have a kind of interactive relationship with the three dimensions of reality. So you were kind of broaching this, and I was wondering, like, if there are other corners of that idea that you've been thinking about or exploring, or how that might fit into the structure of this project that you're imagining.
Yes, I came to the project really through my work on Dennis Oppenheim. So I've written about those transfer drawings, the feedback drawings, and his two-stage transfer drawings where he draws on one or more of his children's backs and they relay it to the wall. So I've thought about those before, and I began to think about other artists like Pindell, who I have done a fair bit of writing on before, who are sort of interacting with television and video specifically. And obviously there is a longer history of artists drawing on celluloid, but I think this work is quite different, and it's exactly as you say, it's through this intimate scale at which it's going to be shown, but also the fact that it can reach people in the domestic setting and can be viewed in the setting of the studio as well. So yes, I think that emphasis on intimacy and this object that can mediate between a surface and a three-dimensional kind of chunkiness, like so many of those TV sets Nam June Paik used, have an almost sculptural quality to them, quite different to TV sets today. So yes, the different ways in which artists might attend to the surface of the screen or to the depth and sort of box-like structure of the object itself is something that interests me. Yes. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, absolutely. And I don't know so much about how television works, sort of how the image meets the screen, but I have this sort of vague sense that there is actually this sort of, the raster is a drawing of lines on the surface of the screen, right? Which is what I was thinking about when you were starting out with these Rauschenberg transfers, that in a way his hand is actually kind of mirroring the rasterization of the image, right?
Exactly, yes. So it was an electron beam, and I think television sets now are different, but certainly these earlier television sets, it's an electron beam that is moving in this pattern of parallel lines and creating the images. And yes, I think that is what Cage is getting at when he suggests that Rauschenberg rubbing the transfer images in a sort of linear back and forth movement is somehow analogous to television imagery, yes. So just both the types of images but also the structure of the image is something that Cage sees as related to television.
Yeah. And do you think that there's a way in which revisiting this quite early new media moment of these really haptic encounters with technology is informative to us in the present, as we also consider contemporary artists working with social media, the internet, or other, more ready-to-hand iterations of technology?
Yeah, I mean, certainly the idea of the screen as an interactive surface, and I was surprised I wasn't familiar with that winky-dink television program, but it's a surprise to see that people were actually treating their television sets that way in the 1950s, because we think of it as so much about a passive viewing experience. So the interactivity, but also this sense of kind of responding to a surface, I think, yes, that does relate to artists working with new media today. I think in order to sort of define the parameters of my project, I probably need to keep it to early television and video. And I think these media had a sort of potential at the moment of their inception that probably didn't continue into the 1990s. But then, of course, new media arrive, new types of small screen. So it probably wouldn't be within the parameters of my project, but I certainly think you can see this interaction between drawing and other new media since the 1980s right up to the present. Yes. Yeah. Thank you, Natalie.
Thanks. Hello.
Hi.
I'm interested in how TV might have inspired artists to think about motion in their drawing. The TV being a static object which contains motion within it, and the drawing also being a static object ultimately, but which is created through the process of some kind of emotion.
Yes, I think that's true, and I think especially in the second half of my lecture, looking at the Oppenheim and the Joan Jonas, these are drawings that are unfolding as we're watching them. And even with Howardena Pindell's video drawings, although the drawing she makes precedes the televised image and it is a static image, when it's overlaid, she's going through this process of waiting for a sort of synergy between the moving image on the screen and the image overlaid. So yes, I also think with the Erin Piper hypothesis series, there's a real difference considering she's mapping spatial and temporal relationships. There's a real difference when the TV is turned off to when it is turned on. And not all of that series involves the television, but there are at least 3 or 4 that I can think of that do. And it becomes a different kind of spatio-temporal relationship, depending on whether there are images and narratives unfolding on the screen, or if it's just being treated as a sort of black object turned off in the studio. Yes.
Do you sense that any of these artists are trying to catch up in a way, or compete, or see how drawing can measure up perhaps to the seduction of TV, sort of like how Cubists were responding to cinema?
I think there's an element of that in the TV gallery. So trying to think, how can we reach out to this broad audience in the way that TV broadcasters are doing? Yes. But I think for artists, it was really about experimenting with newly available media, like the Sony Portapak video camera becomes available, I think, 1967. So this is something that artists really wanted to get their hands on and see how that might transform their work. And of course, it's not only used for drawing-related projects, but in my research, that's what I'm focusing on. But there are other experimental uses of TV, incorporating performance especially, that are emerging at this time. Yes, thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you, Anna, for this thought-provoking talk. I also would have many questions. I really appreciated how you really point out how television is something different for also each country and each cultural background of the singular artist. And I also noticed that kind of a shift in the first example to the late one, especially in the respect to a medium like television, which is not fully handable by the artist, of course. So I would like to know what you think about this surreality of the first that was noticed by Cage in respect to Rauschenberg, like this very interesting feature in television, which can be with the same image can be repeated simultaneously. Yes. And also, I'm wondering if you are considering projects and drawings made for television and for video art. And I'm thinking of Dan Graham in particular, which was really considering the play of the points of view, which is one of the most important things that artists are handling with.
Yeah, that's a good recommendation. And I have thought a little bit in some of my writing on Oppenheim about the relationship between his work and Dan Graham and Dara Birnbaum's work with TV. But that was mainly looking at the way in which they were filming families and showing families to families watching at home. So less of the drawing component. But yes, I think that Dan Graham piece is a really helpful point for inclusion. And in terms of the shift, I definitely think there is a shift. Yes, the seriality in Rauschenberg, we do see these, that baseball player, for example, appears again and again, fainter and fainter in Spinner and Game. But Rauschenberg also seems to have this embrace. He speaks about welcoming this imagery, whereas in the second half of the lecture, it's much more about artists usually working under authoritarian regimes and trying to highlight the control that's being exerted by these images rather than affirming them or embracing them. Yes, thank you, Filippo.
Thank you.
You finished?
Okay, thank you so much, Anna.
Great, thank you.